It's your Wednesday daily delivery. I am Michael Rand. Glad to be back for another day. Hope you guys are having a good day out there as well, and plenty to get to on today's show. Sarah McLellan, Star Tribune beat writer covering the Minnesota Wild, will be with me here in just a few minutes, talking their recent, slump, losses in some important games last week, but also how that factors into Friday's NHL trade deadline. Still one more game between now and then. Wild at Arizona on Thursday night, but some of their moves already probably in the works, thinking about what they're going to do as they kind of reevaluate where they are this season, and not the kind of year they wanted to have, especially coming off of several playoff appearances, things like that. So Sarah and I will get into where they stand and what they're looking for going forward as they kind of recalibrate where they are in their trajectory. We'll have some other hockey nuggets at the end of the show as well, plus some basketball here in just a minute. First, though, what did I miss? It's the story I can't keep thinking about, and the one that you guys can't keep listening to. Can't stop listening to, I should say. I can't stop thinking about Vikings quarterbacks. 5 days now until the negotiating window opens up for free agents in the NFL. 2 days after that is when free agent can sign. Right in there somewhere is where we're going to find out ultimately what's going on with the Vikings and Kirk Cousins. That will be the first domino to fall in their offseason, unless you consider them signing Nick Muse, tight end, on Tuesday, re-signing him. If you consider that to be the first domino, which I don't, but that could be that could be your first domino. But really, this Cousins thing is kind of hanging over them. There's not going to be any other real business until they figure this out. Now, we've reported this week already. I had D. Orlando Ledbetter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution on yesterday's show talking about how Kirk Cousins will be the Falcons' number one target if he gets to free agency. And then there's that interesting kind of space in the middle, right? That starting Monday where they can negotiate, where the Vikings still have a chance to sign Kirk Cousins without having to put the $28.5 million of dead cap money on this year's books, where they could kind of get out from underneath that, re-sign him, redo a deal. So they're probably going to find out exactly what the Falcons are offering, and then they're going to have a chance to say, okay, here's what we can do. So I don't know exactly where this is going. I feel like the last few days it has trended far more towards the Falcons than it was, say, last week. I don't think that's an overstatement to say that. You start to see some national stuff percolating about, hey, is Kirk Cousins on his way to Atlanta, things like that. Don't know what to make all of that yet, and nothing is final until it's final. What I want to talk about today is something I was just thinking about this morning as I was getting ready for the show and kind of like refining what this opening segment was going to be. I think the real interesting thing about this decision is that if the Vikings move on from Kirk Cousins, don't re-sign him, he goes somewhere else, I think that then shifts the onus, shifts the responsibility, shifts the spotlight back onto both Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah and Kevin O'Connell. I think if they re-sign Kirk Cousins, there is more pressure on Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah and not Kevin O'Connell, because I think you kind of have a baseline. You know that Kirk Cousins can operate Kevin O'Connell's offense. I think Kevin O'Connell has a comfort level there. He knows that the thing he does best, which is run the offense, he's an offensive guy, was a quarterback, came from an offensive coordinator role. The thing he does best, he will be able to do on a certain level. But you can't keep Kirk Cousins forever. He's expensive. If you bring in a new quarterback, say that 2024 is some combination of a bridge quarterback and a quarterback you draft, and then you're talking about, okay, can a new quarterback thrive in Kevin O'Connell's system, which certainly didn't happen last year, right? They had three different guys play. You had, the success of the Pastronaut, Josh Dobbs, right away, but then he fell apart. The 3-0 win where he gets benched against the Raiders, plays, poorly in other games. They go to Nick Mullins. He throws for a bunch of yards, but also a bunch of turnovers. They move the ball, but not the offense doesn't quite look the way it should. Jaron Hall starts a game. He looks completely out of sorts. Things like that. Like you want to see what he can do with a young quarterback, because that is going to be their future. So if they move on from Kirk Cousins, I feel like the burden of proof shifts away from just Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, because last year it was a lot of this was on Kwesi, and even he has said that. He said, I did not give them enough depth, especially on defense. We had a good defense. We had a good thing going, but as we got injuries, as the season went along, the too deep was not strong enough, and that is on me. That was, a function of maybe some signings that they made that didn't work out, especially Marcus Davenport. That was a function still of the 2022 draft and not getting enough from the top of that draft class, or barely getting anything at all. Lewis Seen, Andrew Booth Jr., Brian Asamoah, those guys, not enough from those top of the 2022 draft to kind of give them the reinforcements they need. So if they keep Kirk Cousins, I think then the onus is on Kwesi to build around it. If they don't, I think the onus becomes shared, because Kevin O'Connell is going to have a large say in whatever they do at quarterback beyond that, who they draft, who they pick, and it's going to be up to him to develop that quarterback along the way. So that's a little tension I feel right now. That's an interesting kind of way to look at this. I feel like if they do move on from Kirk Cousins, this becomes more of a shared spotlight of, okay, can you get this thing right? If you keep Kirk Cousins, I do feel like Kevin O'Connell will be far less scrutinized than Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. So pay attention to that ultimately in deciding what happens here with the Vikings and their quarterback situation. 2 college basketball games of significance today for Minnesota teams. Let's get to that before we get to Sarah McLellan. Gopher men's basketball team home against Indiana, kind of a must-win for their hopes of making the NCAA tournament. They're 9-9 in the Big Ten, 18-11 overall. In some years, you'd be thinking that's a bubble team. Right now, with where the Big Ten is, which is not great, which is with where Minnesota's non-conference schedule is, which is even worse than not great. They got to have this one. You feel like they got to have the one at Northwestern over the weekend, which will be a tall task, but not an undoable task. And then they got to win at least 1, maybe 2 games in the Big Ten tournament to really play themselves at least onto the bubble. So it starts tonight, final home game of the year. It starts tonight. Of course, they'll play the Big Ten tournament here. I'll get to that with the women in a minute. But so they'll have some home court. They'll have some, not home court, but they'll have some home crowd at Target Center. They'll have some possibilities there to make a run. But it starts at Williams Arena tonight if they're going to have any chance, any realistic at-large berth chance at least, of making the NCAA tournament field. Now, the women, like I said, Big Ten tournament is here. Gophers start play tonight. Fell all the way to the number 11 seed by virtue of their late season struggles without Mara Braun. That was a team that, like we've talked about, was trending toward an NCAA tournament berth, kind of, a third to half of the way through the season. Braun gets injured at Illinois. Everything falls apart. They only won 1 game since then. Their last 2 games have been blowout losses by a combined more than 100 points. They need to regroup. They need to have at least a good showing tonight against Rutgers. Get out of that very first round. They're playing the lowest seeded team in the Big Ten. They're playing in front of what should be some home fans at Target Center in the women's basketball tournament. Can they at least regroup enough to win a game here, to feel like they've got a little bit of momentum to take in the offseason instead of just all this negativity towards the end of the year?
Grand Casino would like to take a moment and salute the true football fan. The passion, the hope, the anticipation, that incomparable feeling of winning. Grand Casino would also like to take a moment to remind you that you can find all that anticipation, thrill, and winning at Grand Casino. Grand Casino, let your story begin.
Let's talk hockey on Daily Delivery today. Sarah McLellan, Wild beat writer, joins me. The Wild have one more game before the trade deadline, Sarah, Thursday against Arizona. How did we get to this spot, Sarah, where it feels like they're kind of like right on the fringe of the playoff race, but a lot of teams in that wild card mix, and then the 2 that are in those 2 positions right now, Nashville and LA, they've opened up a little bit of a gap on the rest of these teams. Do you get a sense for where the Wild feel like they are with just a few days here, a couple days left before the trade deadline?
It's been kind of like a roller coaster these last few weeks, really, when you look at this playoff picture, because if you remember going into their bye week and the All-Star break, they kind of sputtered into it. It looked pretty bleak, coming off of those losses to Nashville and to Anaheim. And, the gap that they had between them and a playoff spot looked pretty intense at that point. But then they have the break, they have the All-Star break, they come out of the break and they start winning games and they really start to get back into contention. They go on that 7-1-1 run. And then after that win at Seattle recently, they were only 2 points out of a playoff spot. And so it looks like, okay, they found their way back into this. There's a chance let's see what happens the rest of the way, especially considering their schedule. They have one of the easier schedules the rest of the way. Could this team that, was struggling so much early in the season near the bottom of the standings, fired, its coach, could this be a team that's now, really legitimately vying for a playoff spot? And could they make the playoffs? But then the aforementioned roller coaster takes off again. It was kind of a rough week last week. Obviously, 3 losses in a row before that win against San Jose on home ice on Sunday. But even so, that still kind of really upped their deficit and put them back in a hole chasing this race. And I think that's what's been unique about this Western Conference playoff race this season is so many teams have been in that race that it's been very difficult for teams when they win to really gain traction and go on a run in the standings and put some distance between them and other teams. Whereas the opposite, since there are so many teams and teams are picking up points on, seemingly a nightly basis, the fact that, the Wild loses 3 games in a row, all of a sudden they drop down the standings to 8 points back at one point. It's just been really stunning to see the shifts and how it really took a team like Nashville winning 8 games in a row to really, claim one of those wild card berths, whereas a team like Calgary had recently won 5 in a row and they were just still in the thick of the race. Like it really takes a substantial run, it looks like, for a team to, potentially nab one of those spots. Does the Wild have that in them? I guess we'll see. We saw that win against the Sharks. Obviously a team near the bottom of the standings. The Wild barely outlasted them. It took a Kirill Kaprizov hat trick. They're going to have more of those games against the teams in the bottom of the standings. Obviously on Thursday against Arizona, they'll play a team that's out of the playoff picture. Can they capitalize on those matchups to try to get on a run and make the type of push that they'll probably, it looks like, need to get back into a potential playoff position that's, legit on the brink, knocking on the door like they were, recently after that win at Seattle. We'll see. I think the fact that there's so many teams in this mix makes it kind of unpredictable, difficult to kind of gauge and see where this ends up. But it's tough. I think it's a tough outlook right now for the team, considering those factors, considering so many teams are jumbled up. Some of them are playing head to head, so that guarantees points going to someone that they're chasing. But yeah, it's been, I think, unpredictable over the last few weeks, the ups and downs. But when you consider where this team was at the beginning of the season, kind of maybe a surprise that they're even, have been this close to contention since they were near the bottom. As we mentioned, Dean Evison was fired, a lot of change, a lot of injuries. So it kind of depends how you can look at that. If you look at this as a lot of progress for them, or is it still just more disappointment because this is a roster that looks very similar to last season's roster, and that roster made the playoffs.
Well, that's a good point. That kind of gets to my next question. That was a good kind of short-term overview, but big picture, how exactly did we get here? Why does a team that by and large, brought back a lot of the same pieces? I mean, they're down Matt Dumba. They've remade themselves in a few ways, but by and large has the same core pieces. Signed a lot of these guys right before training camp to longer deals. Marcus Foligno, Ryan Hartman, bring those guys back. Zuccarello, kind of keep the core together through this, through this stretch where they've got these, obviously got the Suter Parisi buyouts that are still weighing them down. But this is a very similar team, not seeing similar results. And we see that in sports, but have either you or they kind of identified where did this season not quite add up to where they probably would have hoped it would based on last year and even the year before?
I think injuries have played a huge factor in that. Look who's missing out of this lineup, even just right now as they're in this playoff push. Jared Spurgeon, their captain, their stalwart on defense. He hasn't played most of the season. Obviously, he's had season-ending issues with his hip and back, surgery, obviously, that, put him out of commission. And even when he was in the lineup, he wasn't in the lineup much. That's a big loss. Jonas Brodin missed time on the blue line. So they've just constantly been in flux on their back end. As for their forwards, you look who's missing right now: Marcus Foligno, Pat Maroon, players that really bring that bite to their lineup, provide secondary scoring, and give them the depth that in the past, like last season, when this team was playing well and was moving on to the playoffs, they had that. They had scoring lines. They had scoring throughout the lineup. They had that depth on defense, that experience, and those were really their strong suits, especially last season. So injuries, I think, have played a factor. And then too, I think with all the juggling, then you see obviously individual performances get magnified, who can step up, who's performing at a level they have in the past. And a handful of players aren't. Obviously, you see breakout performances, a Brock Faber coming in and him being in contention for the Calder Trophy as the NHL's top rookie. They need that. They need players to come in and fill big roles. But you can look at their goaltending. Has that been at the same level as past seasons? Even just, like you said, the scoring depth that they used to get from lower in their lineup, from the likes of the Frederick Goudreaus or players like that, in the past, they've been able to really get sizable contributions from. And this season, amid the juggling, amid the injuries, amid the coaching change, there just hasn't been that consistency from their lineup and what they've been able to expect production-wise. And that's really, again, what it comes down to in these games. And I think you see it magnified too when they're playing the Nashvilles, the St. Louises, teams that they're in direct competition with, their division rivals. They've really struggled against the division this season, playing the teams that they probably needed to pry points away from to be able to have a chance or a better look in this playoff race. And the struggles have just, I think, maybe been more prominent in how they've been unable to match up in those situations. I think last week, those losses at Nashville and St. Louis were probably kind of really emphasized the story of their season of late. They've been able to get wins. They've been able to pick up points. They string 3 or 4 wins together. But when they really needed that jolt, really needed that lift, those were 2 really big games, potentially season-defining games, maybe when we look back at this in a few months, and they just didn't have enough. They were just off. Their competitiveness, their attention to detail, their execution, it just wasn't there. And so I think that, again, just kind of stands out because in the past, with this group, with this core, they had that execution and they were able to follow through. And it's just been off this season, even though, like we said, they've been able to maybe go on little runs and win streaks here and there and get points and stay relevant to a race that they really, didn't look like they were going to be in at all back in October and November. But it still hasn't lifted them to completely close the gap and get back to the competitiveness that we've come to expect from this team over the last few years, where they're not chasing a spot, they're in a spot. That's really been the difference. Given all that, and given that they have basically like the amount of money you'd find in your couch cushions, that's their cap space right now. Like, given that, like they were buyers at the deadline last year. I mean, they did a little bit of both, I believe, last year. They made some trades out, but they also brought in, guys they thought could help them win in the playoffs. Where do you think they are in terms of the moves they could try to make in the next few days here? I mean, I don't get the idea that they're going to make some blockbusters just by nature of who they want to keep, and guys that might be more trade candidates. A lot of them have those no move clauses, things like that. Who might be a candidate to be on the move here, even if it's kind of from the third or fourth line or kind of the fringes of their defensive pairings? I think they have flexibility, I think with what they can do. And I think that's very much probably indicative of their circumstances, where they're not completely out of it, but they have a long way to go to catch up to a playoff spot. So they're not like a team at the bottom of the standings, a Chicago, a San Jose, that you could see maybe make more wholesale changes and sell off pieces. But they're not in a position where they can trade draft picks or will trade draft picks for short-term help, rental, free agents. So they're kind of in that middle territory where I think they could add or subtract, and add in the sense of maybe they make a hockey trade and they change up their look and, they move somebody out to get somebody else in. having said that, those types of deals usually, happen more, I think, in the off season at the draft,
Sure.
to kind of shake up a look. So you really tend to then look at, okay, who are their free agents, who are on expiring deals. I think for a while, maybe the most intriguing name was Marc-Andre Fleury, their goaltender. What would he do? He's made it clear that he can't see himself asking to be traded. And he is very much in control of his situation. Obviously, with his contract, he has a no movement clause, but I think just with his pedigree, his experience, this being the last season of his contract before he has to make a decision. Does he retire? Does he return? Does he keep playing? So he's very much, in control and can dictate what's next for him. After that, you look at the likes of Pat Maroon, players who are, again, on expiring deals, set to become free agents, but who have a lot of the traits that I think teams covet this time of year. They have experience, they've won Stanley Cups, but they have a style, I think, that really suits teams looking to go on long playoff runs, that grit, that edge. But having said that, those are qualities that help the Wild too. So, it's a situation, I think, where they have flexibility. They have options. These are players that they could hold on to, try to keep, try to re-sign, try to bring back as they go through this next life cycle of their organization. Or again, if somebody calls and it's an offer, too good to turn down, that they want that piece for their cup run or their playoff run. I think the Wild is in a position where it has that flexibility to look at both options, looking at staying put with some players or look at moving on. Another name is Brandon Duhaime. He's in a similar position, again, where he's on, the final stages of his contract. And again, he has a style that playoff teams really like to focus on, and that's speed and that's toughness. Again, so he's someone that has helped the Wild, obviously, with those attributes through the years. But does the possibility of getting something for him, if it's a situation where the team doesn't feel that they could re-sign him next summer. Obviously, we know the budget situation, and there's going to be young players too that are probably going to be knocking at the door for roster, possibilities in the future. We've heard that, what's going to get this team through this budget crunch with the buyouts is players on young players on cheap kind of team friendly deals. And so that could really create a possibility next season where they look more internal rather than giving money and re-signing some players that would be more costly for them. So I think they have options, and I think it's a situation where they'll probably look at each player case by case individually, what makes sense for the team now, but also moving forward and seeing what type of interest those types of players and their resumes merit, leading up to Friday's deadline.
Bill Guerin doesn't strike me as the kind of person who will make a trade just to make a trade, but he also strikes me as the kind of person who likes to make trades. So I think he likes this time of year. I think he might be fairly active, and it doesn't sound like the kind of moves that they're thinking about making would necessarily preclude them from competing still the rest of the year. It's not like they're trading away Joel Eriksson-Ek or, somebody who's like, one of their top players. Like, that doesn't seem like it's on the table. They wouldn't do that because they think they still have a near-term future. They feel like they could be, if not this year, they could be back in the playoff mix next year. And certainly the year after that, when again, they get that cap relief finally. So it does sound to me like fringe moves, but he's going to probably try to maximize whatever they can in those fringes. And then maybe that opens up some spots for guys to come up and fill those roles, 20 games early as opposed to starting next year.
It makes sense. And, I think it is very indicative of where they're at in their life cycle of this organization. They have these buyouts, this big hit against their budget. And how can they still operate around that? And I think, like you said, if they have an opportunity where they can recoup some assets, get more draft picks, get more draft capital, that's going to be helpful for them down the road, because as we've seen, that's really what kind of weathers these tough moments, financially, is having young players come in, having a Marco Rossi come in and a Brock Faber. They've totally had impact just through their play. As rookies, they've really already carved out important roles on this team. But speaking towards the books and the money, it certainly helps a team that they're on, very affordable contracts. So to have players whose importance, is already clear and they're young in their career, but to still be able to have some flexibility, money wise. I think that's huge this time of year. So this is really an opportunity maybe for them to see if they can leverage more of that. But you're right. This core is in place. This core is locked up. We know who the long-term players are. We can tell by the contracts they're on, the security they have in those deals, whether it be no trade clauses, no movement clauses. We saw the extensions handed out before the season to Marcus Foligno, Matt Zuccarello, Ryan Hartman. We can see, who makes up the bulk of this team. And, that's not changing. This is the core. So you're right. It's what can maybe happen around that to set themselves up to finish out this season, but also maybe kind of shape the expectations for next season already too.
Royal Credit Union's smart checking accounts offer no monthly fees and no minimum balance. Enjoy financial freedom when you open your Royal Credit Union smart checking account online at rcu.org/go-checking. Insured by NCUA.
One final thing on this note, you mentioned the goaltending briefly earlier. That was a position of strength last year. The guys that were the position of strength last year are the same guys, but I'd say Fleury has been roughly the same as he was last year, but Gustafsson has not been the same guy. Maybe we shouldn't have expected him to be because, maybe last year, we don't know if last year was the outlier or if this year was the outlier, and that's probably a question they have to ask themselves. But if they thought that was a position of strength coming into the year, they might feel a little bit differently now. So how do they kind of think about that as they head into next year and kind of thinking about Jasper Wallstedt as one of those kind of big cornerstone pieces they hope going forward, that young goalie. He got a small taste earlier this year, didn't go well, but that's not to say that that's going to be his future. That was one game. Where do you think they're at with kind of as they think about their goaltending?
Is probably a position that they will evaluate and probably need to, not only the rest of the season, but into the offseason. And it's going to have to be because of Fleury's situation, figuring out what's next for him. And if he does decide to return, is there a situation where it's here with the Wild? I think, figuring out what happens next is obviously key for him too. But also then you're right. Where's Gustafsson at? And Wallstedt in particular too, I think is unique. We saw that one game, he made his NHL debut. Obviously a very difficult night for him in Dallas, giving up as many goals as he did. But he's had solid numbers in the AHL. He's put the work in there. You can hear him talk about the growth that he's already felt in his game coming over from Sweden. So I don't know if there's an opportunity to maybe get that evaluation before this season's up, get that insight. Could he be ready for more NHL action next season? Or, is it something where he needs another year in the minors to really continue to develop his game? That's probably one of the more interesting positions to evaluate for this franchise, just because they do kind of seem to be at a crossroads. If Fleury doesn't return, where do they go next? And is a Gustafsson-Wallstedt partnership the one that they want to really usher this team through this next season? And then you're right, when the buyouts come off and they're going to have so much cap flexibility, then it really seems like the stars could align that that's a real opportunity with that season if their talent continues to trend the way it has showed even already this season with Matt Boldy and Kirill Kaprizov, and just where these players are at entering really the prime of their career. I think it'll be fascinating to see how they evaluate that, because I think Wallstedt is definitely an intriguing prospect, but making that jump and him turning into a pro NHLer can be difficult to size up that timeline and know when a player's ready. But you're right. I think it's a position that's really been steady for the team in the past. And that's when they have a lot of their success. When they're pretty airtight in net, it just kind of acts as that base and foundation for their style and the way they want to generate, which starts in their own end, the way they want to move up ice. And so that's probably something, to keep an eye on the rest of this season, but then especially next summer, seeing what happens with Fleury and how they plan to really fill out that position moving forward.
Maybe not a conversation for this summer, but I'm already thinking about Kaprizov and his next contract and just how that fits together, because he's got 2 years after this. Is that right? I think. And then it's kind of that last year, the last year of his deal, I feel like is the first year where they're not penalized by the cap. But at a certain point, there's going to be that to think about as well. Not right now, but maybe a little bit down the road. Yeah,
and I think too, lately, you've really seen him kind of step up amid this second half push. And obviously he'd been bothered by injury, and, it looked maybe like he was having kind of a slower production rate than in the past. And, he wasn't playing, while he was recovering from injury. So that obviously sapped and subtracted some games from him that he could have been a factor. But lately, especially like that San Jose game, he looks like the player of the past and of that pedigree, where he is that franchise type player. And, it'll be interesting to see how he continues to, maybe have that impact and that effect the rest of the way, because you saw him really take over a game on Sunday against San Jose, record his third hat trick of the year, not the season, of the year. We're barely into March. So, he's now very close to 30 goals. Is another 40 goal season, available to him? Maybe, probably, if he continues to produce at this rate. But, even though he was bothered again by injury and had some time out of the lineup, he still looks like he is that player that'll be obviously very key to this team's success. And on some nights, it looks like he can dictate it by himself.
Well, we'll see how many of his teammates are still there in a few days. Trade deadline coming up. Sarah will have that covered. Star Tribune, startribune.com. Sarah, we will talk again soon.
Sounds good.
And I should say one addendum to that conversation with Sarah McLellan. Zach Bogosian would have been a candidate we would have talked about, but he signed a 2-year extension with the Wild on Tuesday. He was looking as a potential trade candidate with an expiring contract going into the week, but he signs a 2-year, $2.5 million deal. Kind of one of those inexpensive guys, not one of the young guys, but one of those inexpensive guys they'll need to carry themselves into kind of that next year where they're still paying all those cap penalties, all those buyout penalties for Parisi and Suter, and then even the year after that. So a guy that they've decided they want to lock up on a multi-year low-cost deal to be in that lineup. So Zach Bogosian off the market, but plenty of other people potentially in play as we go into about 48 hours, little over 48 hours left until the NHL trade deadline. Let's finish up with the cooler. Couple quick hockey thoughts. Minnesota's PWHL team got a win on Tuesday. One of the only local teams in action on Tuesday night. So a good chance for them to be in the spotlight and a good win for them in a shootout. That was a fun one to watch. I don't know how many of you watched that one, but I caught quite a few of the highlights of that one at least. And that was a good win for Minnesota's PWHL team. And now boys hockey taking center stage at XL Energy Center this weekend, starting today, actually, with the hockey tournament. One of my favorite things to cover of all time. I don't know how much I'll get over there this year with everything else going on, but what an event. If you have a chance, if you can get over there, if you've never seen it, or if you've seen it 30 times, it doesn't matter. Some of the best memories, some of the greatest writing, some of the best moments you will ever see will come out of that tournament. So looking forward to that, looking forward to everything this weekend, looking forward to getting over to the Big Ten women's basketball tournament, planning to go Friday night, check out this Caitlin Clark phenomenon for my own eyes. So go check out all the stuff that's happening. It is a great time to be a Minnesota sports fan. That will do it for me today. Should have Chris Hine on Thursday's show to talk Timberwolves, coming off that long homestand, heading into a long road trip. Where are they at? 20 games left in the season. Chris and I will talk about that on Thursday's show. Until then, I'm Michael Rand, back at it again tomorrow.